didn't study film in school, but devoured a lot of cinema at the local art house. And when I graduated college, I was trying to understand what I wanted to do with myself, which I think is a very typical point in terms of kind of identity and self and that whole, who do I want to be moment. And in college, I knew that I was interested in social justice oriented work. I wasn't sure what that meant. I thought a lot about more public service oriented or international relief work. But I was also very interested in art. My major was art history, and I actually did a lot of deep studying of many different moments in the evolution of the visual arts. And then I had this other piece, which was just that I loved watching films. And for some reason, I think because I didn't grow up in a family of artists, it didn't occur to me that I could have a career making films. So this summer after I graduated college, I really came back home living with my parents, typical situation. And I really started thinking about how could I step into film as a potential career, not having gone to film school, not knowing anything about, I didn't know what a boom was. I didn't know anything. And so what I did was I made a list of all the films that I had loved in the last few years, mostly from this art house cinema. It was called the Tontine movie house, I think, Tontine Cinema. And I went backwards because, again, I didn't know anything about the making of the films. I thought, well, maybe I start with the business of. So I went backwards. I looked at who had distributed the films, who had produced the films, what were the different companies in New York. And I just started reaching out to many of them. At the time, it was faxes, mostly. And it was just dead end after dead end. Just to pick up a phone in New York, at the time, at least, in any film company, you needed some level of experience because they thought of them as internships, and they're mostly film students or kids who'd made something. And I had zero exposure. So I just kept knocking on doors. And I found this social issue documentary company called Big Mouth Productions. I found them online. And when I started reading about their mission, who was behind it, the work that they had put out, I was just completely fascinated. And frankly, that was the first time that I came across a company who was not only making films that were the types of films that I was quickly realizing I would love to get involved with myself, but it was also just the structure of it. Though it was a female-led team, it was a small team, and they weren't just committed to making the films themselves, but to then putting some social impact campaigns around it and to doing deep work in whatever that issue or space was that the film dealt with. So I reached out to them, and they offered me an unpaid internship, and that's where I got started. So in there, I actually, in New York, I spent 2 years in New York. I ended up doing a series of PA jobs, production assistant jobs. So I was on many much bigger Hollywood sets. Once you get into that circuit, you kind of can go from job to job. And I was just a production assistant doing whatever needed to be done. But being on those sets, I learned a lot of just essentials. Frankly, if nothing else, I just got more comfortable with the idea that film wasn't this big crazy machine. It was just a bunch of people working together to make something. And I think that removed that mystery. And in the middle of all of this, so it was about 2 years of freelance production work in New York, I was introduced to Nicole Guillemette, who at the time had just left Sundance to come run the festival in Miami. And Nicole and I met, and we got along beautifully, and we thought it was going to be that I'd work with her that season for a few months. And it turned into this, really great relationship and friendship. And I moved back to Miami full time. And so I worked as a year-round staff person, which is unusual. Usually at the film festival, you have just a handful of very few people working year-round. Mostly it's seasonal. And that was where I really watched the more films than I've watched in my entire life. It was just hundreds of films every year. And as I said, I think the film festival was very formative, not just the making of the films. I'm sorry, not just the watching of the films, but spending time with the filmmakers. And the other thing that was really interesting about working at the film festival in that capacity, I was wearing many hats, but working very hands-on with all the industry people along with the creatives. When it came time then to break away from the, to leave the festival and make my first film, Monica and David, I wasn't as intimidated by the industry side. So I had spent a lot of time looking at, as a programmer, what worked and didn't work about films. When you're working on the programming side, you see a lot of films that are a bit more raw. So they're not necessarily the films that end up getting released or distributed. I saw a pretty broad variety, and it was very instructive. But it was also very helpful to not feel intimidated by the industry side of it and feel like more of an equal when talking to a distributor or talking to a festival programmer. And those were the tools, I think, that helped me make the film, but then get the film out into the world.